hoping for the best is not an acceptable strategy. I believe that our authorities need to get out of their box. I'm not one of those authorities. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a healthcare administrator. I'm a professor of management. But I established my reputation by reframing some basic ideas in management. The strategy is much more about learning than it is about planning. If anything needs reframing, it's this pandemic. We need action. We don't need plans. We're stuck. Our authorities are stuck. We're all stuck, and we all feel helpless. We kill our economies if we keep them closed, and we kill more of ourselves if we open them up. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. And our authorities have been telling us the same thing for month after month. Essentially, it boils down to keep your distance, which means more than 2 meters from people who might be infected. And if you can't do that, wear a mask. And that is critically important. With the second wave, it's now more important than it's ever been, but it's not sufficient. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a second wave. We need to do something else. We need to do more, and we need to stop being so helpless and expecting everything to come from authorities who I think are stuck. An example of not being sufficient are the aerosols. The aerosols are very tiny particles. They're much smaller than the droplets that fall within 1 or 2 meters and then affect people directly. The aerosols can affect people more indirectly. They can affect people at greater than 2 meters, 6 feet, maybe 10 meters, who knows? It's all being studied now as to how far they can infect. The point is that there's some intermediate distance at which the aerosols can infect people, which is longer than the 1 to 2 meters that we keep talking about. And that means, of course, that you better wear masks, not only when you're 1 to 2 meters away from people. Back in April, I came across a study that has since become better known, but wasn't at that point, by a group of Italian scientists right in the middle of the horrible outbreaks in northern Italy. And they found 2 things that were really interesting. One is that pollution seemed to be associated with the outbreaks, that the more polluted the area, the more likely they were to have outbreaks. And the second thing, which is not confirmed but looks kind of interesting, is that the particles of aerosol could adhere possibly to particles of pollution, which would enable them to travel much farther. So you had an immediate form of infection where you're sitting at a table with someone within 2 meters. You have an intermediate form where the aerosols are carrying the virus around, maybe in a ventilating system of a senior residence or in a restaurant beyond 2 meters, and maybe a third that means much farther, maybe across a polluted city. Before I read that article of the Italian report, I was wondering about several questions that seemed curious. For example, why are so many people who get infected not able to trace that infection back to anybody? Now, the aerosols could explain that they were more than 2 or 3 meters away, but the pollution hypothesis might just explain it even better. We looked at the 10 biggest outbreaks in the world. It was in about 5 or 6 different countries, and every single one of them was in highly polluted areas, whether Wuhan in China or New York City or whatever. Second of all, this remains curious. Why are the cases everywhere? You can find people who are infected almost everywhere in the world, and yet the outbreaks are not everywhere. The outbreaks are only in some places. Again, pollution might be a factor, or there might be something else going on, but there is something else going on that we're not recognizing. The third thing has an explanation, and that is that although these outbreaks come and go, they come who knows where, and they go rather quickly, you know, they kind of disappear rather quickly, and there is an obvious explanation for that, which means if you lock people down in their houses, they can infect other people because they're not in contact with other people. But they also can't pollute because they're not driving, they're not going to work, and so they're not polluting. So you have two possible explanations. The interesting thing about the second possible explanation is that if you reopen the economies and reopen the polluting, as you've done, because after all, a lot of these cities were clear when the people were locked down. The air was clear. They were seeing mountains in some of these cities for the first time in years. So if you reopen the economy and you reopen the pollution, start polluting again, you're liable to get a second wave. Guess what? Then I came across a study which I've seen not referenced anywhere else. Just happened to pick it up in a BBC report that somebody sent me, that in Brazil, when the farmers, this is during the influenza period earlier, when the farmers were burning their trees they had cut down and so on, and creating a huge amount of smoke, the admittances to hospitals for influenza went up markedly. Now, how could that be? The guy who did that study, his name is Forrest Mims, an American from Texas who looked into this. He said it could have to do with the ultraviolet rays of the sun. Normally, they inactivate viruses that are in the air. But when the smog or the smoke is so heavy, those rays are blocked, and that enables those viruses to live longer and therefore travel farther. And that might explain what was going on in Brazil. Well, people always say that I'll believe it when I see it, and I tend to say that I'll see it when I believe it. So I started believing in smoke, just for fun, to see where it goes. We need more fun in this, to see where things go. And so I started looking around for the presence of smoke in some outbreaks, and lo and behold, I could find it in all kinds of places. For example, hog plants in several countries have been known to have major outbreaks. Well, hog plants smoke their pork. They have smoking processes. Could be. In China, in Beijing, for example, there was an outbreak in a market, as there was in Wuhan. Well, they roast ducks in Chinese markets. That's smoke. Okay. And then there was a famous case in the American embassy in Saudi Arabia where there was an outbreak. Why in the world was there an outbreak in the American embassy in Saudi Arabia? Well, it came shortly after a barbecue. More smoke. Proof? No proof. But suspicion? Yes. Suspicion that is worth investigating. Let's investigate a couple of other things. India has a huge outbreak. When people die in India, they're cremated in funeral pyres. That creates one heck of a lot of smoke. So could it be that in India, the more people die and therefore get cremated, the more people get sick? It's possible. I can't prove it, but somebody should be looking into it, no? What about pot on the university campuses? That's smoke. Who knows? Look, what we have now suggests that pollution could have two effects on the pandemic, and in fact, we know that it has a third effect. The first one I call bonding, okay? We're not positive, but there could be some bonding process that's carrying this virus around. Some scientists think those aerosols are too heavy to travel around like that, but who knows? The second I call blocking, which is the ultraviolet rays, that by blocking the ultraviolet rays, they enable the virus to live longer in the atmosphere. And the third, which we know, is that people who live in polluted atmospheres for long periods of time get all kinds of respiratory, probably you can tell I'm not an epidemiologist, right? They get all kinds of respiratory problems and also problems with their immune systems, and therefore are more susceptible not only to getting sicker, that we know well, but also to getting sick, that we know too, that they could get it in the first place because they've lived in polluted air. That makes a pretty strong case for investigating, not for proving, but for investigating pollution. You know, the trouble with proving is it takes months or years. The advantage of investigating is you can try things, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Anyway, I started to write all this up, and I started to send what I was writing up to editors of opinion pages to try and get it published. And for those who bothered to reply, the answer was always the same: not enough evidence. Well, that's curious because we're opening up our economies, we're opening up our schools, and you show me the evidence for the safety of that. You know, it's a kind of lopsided argument. You need more evidence, but we have no evidence and we're proceeding. You know what? Hoping for the best is not an acceptable strategy. Okay, so is pollution the answer? No, pollution is not the answer. But pollution could be an answer together with aerosol movement and so on. The getting infected immediately through the big droplets, intermediately through aerosols, and distantly through aerosols somehow bonding with polluted particles in the air. You know what? The real answer is to reframe the question. Stop asking why and start asking why not. Why not? Why not try things immediately? We might get answers within weeks. So why not just try it? Try something in several places. Just one hog plant. Don't close the plant. If there's an outbreak, close the smoking process and see if that does it. Okay, on a campus, stop the pot smoking, stop the vaping, which carries, it's not smoke, but it carries certain metals around. In one school or one office, check the air very, very carefully for all kinds of possible contaminants and get them out of it. Get them out of the air. In a city, stop the polluting. We stopped it. In so many cities, they were amazed, you know, wow, we can see the mountains again. We stopped the polluting because we locked people down. Well, we can use selective closures to lock down not the whole economy, but just those parts of the economy that are doing the most polluting. And we can do things about the traffic. We've already started to do things about cutting down on the traffic and in all kinds of ways, electric cars, and we've got electric, other ways of generating electricity in cities and so on. Okay, here's something that might be more surprising, okay? We have two problems that are far, far greater than this pandemic. Do you know how many people every year die as a consequence of living in polluted environments? I've seen figures ranging from 4 million to 8 million. 1 million people have died so far from this pandemic. That's horrible. That's this year, just this year. Every year, 4 to 8 million people are dying, and we're not dealing with it. Oh, we got used to it, you know, so people are dying from respiratory problems, you know. So what? That's one. And the other is climate change, which could be killing a lot more of us. It could be killing life as we know it. Everybody wants to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We have this golden opportunity to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Maybe we can do something to turn around the pandemic. Certainly we can do something about those 4 to 8 million people. And certainly we can do something about climate change. In fact, we must do something about climate change. And the way to do it, it seems to me, beyond the authorities or pushing the authorities, is to localize the response. Deal with pollution in your own environment, and then around the world we deal with pollution. We localize this global problem. So please, try it. Do it. Stop it.